For years, those discharges out of Lake Okeechobee have poisoned our beaches, killed fish, and cost Florida millions in lost tourism.
But let's take a closer look at the green, blue algae and the colors on this satellite. They represent different levels of algae on the lake. If we could pull that up.
In December of 2024, satellite passes over South Florida started catching something that looked less like weather and more like a wound. Two dark plumes bleeding out from the edges of the largest freshwater lake in the state, one crawling east toward the Atlantic, one crawling west toward the Gulf of Mexico. Within days, the water at public boat ramps and boardwalks on both coasts had gone from blue-green to the color of steep tea. This is the true story of how that happened, why it was allowed to happen, and why almost everyone who has studied Lake Okeechobee will tell you it is going to happen again. Let's start with the lake itself, because most people who have heard of Lake Okeechobee have never actually seen it, and almost no one outside Florida understands what it does. Okeechobee is enormous. It covers roughly 730 square miles, making it the largest freshwater lake fully contained within the southeastern United States and one of the largest in the entire country. Stand on its southern shore and you cannot see the far side. There's no horizon line where water meets land, only water meeting sky. And yet for something so vast, it is strangely shallow, averaging only about 9 feet deep, with long stretches where a person could wade out 100 yards and still not be swimming. That combination, enormous surface area and shallow depth, is exactly what made the lake so lethal before anyone tamed it. On September 16, 1928, a catastrophic hurricane crossed directly over Lake Okeechobee with sustained winds well over 100 miles an hour, after already tearing through Puerto Rico and the Bahamas earlier that same week. At the time, the lake had no real containment. Its banks were low earthen berms, and the surrounding farmland was worked largely by black migrant laborers harvesting beans, sugarcane, and winter vegetables in the rich muck soil that made the region so agriculturally valuable in the first place. The hurricane's winds pushed the lake's entire volume against its southern edge, the berms gave way, and a wall of water swept across the farmland in the dark, catching entire communities with almost no warning. Estimates place the death toll at 2,500 people or more, and historians generally agree the real number was higher, since many victims, overwhelmingly black farm workers, were buried in hastily dug mass graves, cremated where they fell, or never formally counted at all. At the time, it stood as one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history, and unlike a great many hurricanes, this one was widely seen even then as preventable, a disaster of engineering as much as weather. The response to that disaster is the reason the lake looks the way it does today. The federal government ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to build a containment system, and over the following decades the Corps constructed the Herbert Hoover Dike, an earthen levee that runs more than 140 miles and completely encircles the lake. By the 1960s, Okeechobee had gone from a natural, occasionally overflowing lake to a fully engineered reservoir, and the system was expanded further in the following decades with canals, locks, and pumping stations that gave engineers precise control over how much water moved and in which direction. Water could no longer spread naturally across the land during high water events. It could only leave through man-made outlets, 2 rivers, one running east to the Atlantic and one running west to the Gulf, plus a limited southward flow into what remains of the Everglades. For the farmland that had been devastated in 1928, and for the towns that grew up along the lake's southern edge afterward, the dike represented a promise that the same disaster would never happen twice. On that specific promise, it has largely delivered. The lake has not breached its banks again in the way it did in 1928, even through major storms like Hurricane Wilma in 2005 and Hurricane Ian in 2022, both of which put serious stress on the aging structure and triggered years of reinforcement work that only finished up in 2023. That engineering solved the flooding problem. It also created a completely different one, and this is the part that most explainers skip. Before the dike, Lake Okeechobee's water moved south naturally, filtering slowly through hundreds of miles of Everglades marsh before reaching Florida Bay. That marsh acted as a giant, slow filter, cleaning the water as it went. Once the dike went up, that southward flow was cut off, and the land between the lake and the remaining Everglades was drained and converted into farmland, an area still known today as the Everglades Agricultural Area, hundreds of thousands of acres of sugarcane, vegetables, and cattle operations that turn into one of the most productive farming regions in the country, and one of the most politically powerful. Farming at that scale requires fertilizer, and fertilizer means phosphorus, and for the better part of a century, agricultural runoff carrying that phosphorus has flowed into the lake and settled into its sediment, because the lake, cut off from its natural outlet, now had nowhere else for it to go. It just sank and stayed. Scientists have been warning since at least the 1990s that the mud at the bottom of Okeechobee holds a massive reserve of what's called legacy phosphorus, essentially decades of buried fertilizer, sitting quietly until something disturbs it. That something is usually the same decision, made over and over, for exactly the same reason. The lake has to be kept within a narrow, safe range. Too high, and the aging dike is at risk during a major storm. Too low, and the lake's own ecology, its grass beds, its fish, its wildlife, starts to collapse from the opposite direction. When the water rises past what the Corps considers safe, there are really only two places to send it: east down the St. Lucie River toward the Atlantic, or west down the Caloosahatchee River toward the Gulf. Both rivers were modified generations ago, specifically to serve as relief valves for the lake. Neither one was built to handle it without consequences. Those consequences aren't hypothetical. The St. Lucie River empties into the Indian River Lagoon, widely considered one of the most biologically diverse estuaries in North America, home to manatees, dolphins, sea turtles, and thousands of other species that depend on a very specific balance of fresh and salt water. Push a large, sudden volume of lake water into that system, and you don't just dilute the salinity, you also deliver a concentrated dose of nutrients that fuels explosive algae growth, including toxic cyanobacteria capable of making people sick. The Caloosahatchee River on the west side carries a similar burden into the Gulf, where nutrient-rich lake water is known to intensify red tide, a naturally occurring but increasingly severe bloom of the organism Carenia brevis, which produces neurotoxins that kill fish by the thousands and can cause respiratory problems in people simply breathing the air near an affected beach. Florida has already lived through what these releases can do at their worst, more than once. In 2016, a massive blue-green algae bloom fed partly by Lake Okeechobee discharges coated the Treasure Coast in thick green slime thick enough to show up clearly in aerial news footage, prompted a state of emergency from the governor's office, and devastated tourism along the St. Lucie River for a full season, with waterfront businesses reporting empty docks and canceled bookings for months. In 2018, a severe red tide event tied in part to nutrient loading from the lake killed an enormous volume of marine life along the Gulf Coast, with dead fish, dolphins, manatees, and sea turtles washing up on beaches from Naples to Tampa Bay for weeks on end, and news crews running the same grim beach footage on a loop night after night because there was nothing else to show. Independent economic analyses tied to that single event put the losses to Lee County alone in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and a broader study commissioned by regional conservation groups estimated that a comparable future bloom could cost Southwest Florida's economy more than $5 billion in lost output, put over 40,000 jobs at risk, and shave billions more off waterfront property values across the region. Neither of those events happened in isolation. Both followed large-scale lake releases, and both are cited constantly by scientists and advocacy groups as the reason nutrient-loaded discharges are treated as such a serious risk every time the lake runs high. So, by the time December 2024 arrived, none of this was new. What was new was the timing and the scale of what happened next, and the fact that it happened in direct conflict with a plan that was specifically designed to prevent it. In 2023, after years of public workshops and negotiation between agricultural interests, environmental groups, and coastal communities, the Army Corps finalized a new set of rules for managing the lake called the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, LOSM for short. Environmental groups on both coasts had pushed hard for this plan, and many of them believed it contained real, if imperfect, limits on the kind of large emergency discharges that had caused so much damage in the past. The strengthening of the Herbert Hoover Dike, completed the same year, was part of what made the new manual possible in the first place, giving the Corps more flexibility because the levee itself could tolerate higher water levels without the same catastrophic failure risk. Less than a year after LOSM was finalized, the Corps decided it needed to act. A wetter-than-expected dry season, driven partly by lingering El Niño conditions, had kept the lake higher than normal heading into winter, well above the level water managers generally consider comfortable going into the following year's storm season. On December 7, 2024, the Army Corps' regional commander, Colonel Brandon Bowman, ordered both spillways opened wide, aiming to lower the lake by roughly 4 feet over the following months. The releases were not small, and they were not brief. Reporting at the time described more than 1 billion gallons of water a day pouring out of each spillway, continuously day and night, for a planned span of roughly 3 months, sent simultaneously east into the St. Lucie River and west into the Caloosahatchee. To put that volume in perspective, that is enough water leaving through each spillway every single day to fill well over 1,500 Olympic swimming pools, sustained for weeks at a stretch, not as a single dramatic surge, but as a steady, grinding release that outlasted most people's attention spans long after the initial news coverage faded. The reaction from people who had spent years working on the water quality issue was immediate, and it wasn't subtle. Gil Smart, who leads the clean water advocacy group Vote Water on the Treasure Coast, had spent years pushing for exactly the kind of operating rules LASM was supposed to represent, sitting through public workshops and negotiations that were meant to finally give the estuary some protection, and he did not hide his frustration when the releases began, warning bluntly that the discharge was going to make an already bad situation worse for a St. Lucie estuary that had barely begun to recover from years of prior runoff. On the Gulf side, conservation groups, including the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation and the Calusa Waterkeeper, raised the same alarm about the Caloosahatchee, warning that large-scale releases risked fueling the kind of red tide bloom that had already devastated the region's economy once before, particularly given research showing that lake discharges can measurably intensify Carenia brevis blooms already present in the Gulf, rather than simply adding more polluted water to the mix. Within the lake itself, biologists tracking submerged vegetation reported significant die-off of tape grass, pondweed, and bulrush, the same plants that support the lake's prize bass fishery and much of its broader food web, from wading birds to juvenile fish that use the grass beds as nursery habitat. Some described the damage to that vegetation as the worst the lake had experienced since Hurricane Wilma tore through the region back in 2005, a comparison that carried real weight among people who had spent decades tracking the lake's ecological ups and downs and rarely reached for it lightly. And then there was the color. Anyone who has spent time on these rivers during a major release describes the same thing: clear or lightly tinted water gradually giving way, over the course of a day or two, to a dark, opaque tea-colored flow that keeps sunlight from reaching the bottom, visible from a bridge, a dock, or an airplane window without needing a satellite to spot it. That darkening isn't just runoff mud. It's a mix of tannins, organic compounds released as decomposing plant matter, and disturbed lake bottom sediment breakdown, exactly the same chemistry that gives brewed tea or steeped oak leaf their color, now spread across miles of open river and eventually coastal water. Where sunlight can't penetrate, underwater grasses stop photosynthesizing, and prolonged darkness can kill beds of vegetation that took years to re-establish after previous discharge events. Where large volumes of organic material decompose quickly, bacteria consuming that material pull oxygen out of the water faster than it can be replenished, and dissolved oxygen levels can drop low enough, in the worst pockets, to suffocate fish outright, a condition scientists call hypoxia, or in its most severe form, anoxia. None of this is a mysterious phenomenon dreamed up to explain something inexplicable. It is a well-understood, extensively documented consequence of moving huge volumes of nutrient and sediment-laden water very quickly, and it has happened in some form every single time the lake has needed a major emergency release for decades. What made December 2024 stand out wasn't the underlying chemistry, which experts have understood for years. It was the timing, coming right after a plan specifically negotiated to prevent this kind of event, and the scale, sustained continuously for months rather than days, that pushed the visible damage further than many of the people who spent years negotiating LASM expected to see so soon after it was finally signed. The deeper problem, the one nobody managing the lake can simply engineer their way around, is that the phosphorus sitting in Okeechobee sediment did not arrive last month, or last year, or even last decade. It has been accumulating since the mid-20th century, layer upon layer of agricultural runoff, settling into lake bottom mud that, under normal conditions, mostly sits undisturbed. There is no practical, large-scale technology that can simply extract 70 years of legacy nutrients from a lake this size. The contamination isn't a spill that can be cleaned up. It's baked into the geography of the place, which means every future release carries some risk of stirring it loose again, and the lake's managers are boxed in on every side. Keep the water high to avoid disturbing the sediment, and the aging dike comes under more stress heading into hurricane season. Lower it quickly to protect the dike, and you risk exactly what happened in December 2024. Send more water south into the remaining Everglades instead of out to the coasts, and you're sending nutrient-heavy water into one of the most sensitive wetland ecosystems in the country, one that has already lost the vast majority of its historic footprint. There's no version of lake management at Okeechobee that doesn't involve choosing which downstream ecosystem absorbs the damage. This is why the long-term fix everyone points to, a multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade program called the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CRP, exists in the first place. Authorized back in 2000 as a joint federal and state partnership, CRP, was designed to rebuild something closer to the lake's original natural water flow. Dozens of individual projects, including new reservoirs to store excess water during wet periods, treatment marshes that use aquatic vegetation to strip nutrients out of the water before it ever reaches the coasts or the remaining Everglades, and modified operating rules that give managers far more room to maneuver without resorting to emergency dumps in the first place. Two of the marquee projects meant to give the system that flexibility, a large reservoir planned for the old agricultural area directly south of the lake and another on the Caloosahatchee side known as the C-43 Reservoir, have been moving through design, funding fights, land acquisition, and construction for years, slowed at different points by shifting federal budgets, litigation, and sustained political pressure from the region's powerful sugar industry, which has fought aspects of the plan since it was first proposed. Neither project was far enough along to meaningfully change what happened in December 2024. The infrastructure that was supposed to make events like this rare arrived too late to stop this one, and by most independent accounts from the Water Management District and outside conservation groups alike, key pieces of it remain years away from being fully online, which means the same basic bottleneck, too much water, too little capacity to store or treat it before sending it somewhere, is likely to still be in place the next time a wet winter pushes the lake high again. None of this is unique to Florida, and that's really the uncomfortable takeaway underneath all of it. Any large lake or reservoir that has spent generations absorbing agricultural or industrial runoff is sitting on a similar buried inventory, just waiting for the right combination of weather and water management decisions to stir it loose. Parts of the Great Lakes carry a century of industrial and agricultural legacy pollution in their sediments, which is part of why blooms in western Lake Erie have become a recurring summer concern for cities that draw drinking water from it. The Chesapeake Bay has struggled for decades with nutrient runoff from farms and developed land across its enormous watershed, producing low-oxygen dead zones that shrink and expand with rainfall and management practices from one year to the next. And the Mississippi River drains agricultural runoff from a huge swath of the American Midwest into the Gulf of Mexico, feeding a hypoxic zone that reliably reappears every summer and, in bad years, has covered an area larger than the state of Connecticut. Warmer water holds less oxygen to begin with, which makes hypoxia easier to trigger. Heavier, more intense rainfall driven by a changing climate stirs up sediment more aggressively and delivers bigger nutrient pulses than the slower, steadier rains these systems were originally designed around decades ago. What happened at Lake Okeechobee in December 2024 wasn't some freak, unprecedented event that came out of nowhere. It was a very old problem, 70 years of accumulated agricultural runoff sitting quietly in lake bottom mud, meeting a very modern set of pressures, an aging levee only recently reinforced, an unusually wet dry season, and a brand new management plan still working out its own real-world limits, all colliding at the same time in the same place on both coasts at once. The health advisories issued along both coasts after the December releases were a direct, practical response to that collision. Warnings against swimming and fishing in visibly affected water, and cautions for anyone living near the canals to steer clear until conditions improved. Those kinds of advisories have become almost a seasonal fixture in parts of the Treasure Coast and Southwest Florida, not because anyone wants them to be, but because the underlying conflict, an aging containment system holding back both floodwater and 70 years of buried fertilizer, hasn't gone away, and won't go away until the restoration infrastructure that's supposed to replace this whole approach is finally finished. So where does that leave the people who actually live on these rivers? Largely in the same position they've been in for years, watching the water forecasts each winter the way people elsewhere watch hurricane tracks, because a wet season, a stressed dike, or a delayed reservoir project can turn their stretch of river the color of coffee with very little warning. Charter captains on the Caloosahatchee learned to read the discharge schedule the way farmers read weather almanacs, because a big release can mean canceled bookings for weeks. Families along the St. Lucie keep an eye on the local water quality dashboards before deciding whether it's safe to let the kids swim off the dock. Advocacy groups on both coasts, from Vote Water on the Treasure Coast to the Calusa Waterkeeper and the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation on the Gulf side, keep pushing for stricter limits on discharge volume and timing, and keep showing up at public meetings year after year to make the same arguments to whichever Army Corps commander currently holds the job. Scientists keep monitoring dissolved oxygen and phosphorus levels after every major release, largely because there's no other way to know how bad a given event actually was until the water itself is tested, sample by sample, river mile by river mile. And the Army Corps keeps making the same fundamentally unwinnable calculation every wet season. How much risk to the dike is acceptable against how much damage to the coast is acceptable, because right now, there simply isn't a third option that avoids both. That's the real story behind the black water that showed up in December 2024, and the plumes that were visible enough to show up clearly in satellite and aerial imagery on both coasts at once. It wasn't a mystery, and despite how it looked from above, it wasn't something nobody saw coming. Everyone who works on this issue, from the Army Corps engineers running the spillway gates to the advocacy groups filing public comments to the biologists pulling water samples off the docks, understood almost immediately what was happening and why. It was the same trade-off Florida has been making since the 1960s, playing out again on a bigger scale, because the infrastructure meant to finally end that trade-off still isn't finished. Until it is, Lake Okeechobee will keep doing exactly what it was engineered to do 70 years ago. Hold the water in, hold the pollution in, and let both out only when there's truly no other choice left, one wet winter at a time, one coastline at a time, for as long as the reservoirs and treatment marshes that are supposed to change that equation remain under construction instead of finished.